South Korea's park has defended the U.S. THAAD deployment despite massive protests. Is THAAD solely for defensive purposes? In this edition of the debate, we'll break down the U.S. push for the system to be installed in South Korea and other areas where the U.S. is militarily involved under the Pivot to Asia program, something that China has stated time and again is contributing to tensions in the region.
A large number of residents in South Korea's Seongju County, where a U.S. missile system is planned to be deployed, had their heads shaved in public on Monday. Participants in the event said their rally was meant to vent anger at the government's insistence on going ahead with the deployment.
We are holding this head-shaving event because we cannot fight the government. This is the most powerful way of displaying our protest, and we wish the government to take what is wrong and correct it. We cannot protest any more than this.
THAAD should not be deployed at all, not just in Seongju, but anywhere in South Korea. We residents gathered here and shaved our heads to demonstrate against its deployment.
This is not the first time Seongju's residents come to the streets to protest the deployment of the American missile system known as THAAD. They've constantly demanded the government withdraw the decision since the announcement was made in July. They believe THAAD will jeopardize their environment. They're also concerned that their county will become a target in potential conflicts with South Korea's adversaries, particularly North Korea. The United States and South Korea's move to create the missile system has also been raising controversy outside South Korea in recent months. Countries like China and Russia have been critical of the deployment, saying Washington is using tensions on the Korean peninsula as a pretext in order to push with its military expansion in the region. Analysts believe China and Russia are likely to react to the deployment of THAAD.
I think there will be countermeasures, just as we've seen with the deployment of American missiles in Eastern Europe, supposedly against an Iranian threat, and the Russians say, okay, fine, then we have no choice but to target these countries. I think we will see the Chinese and possibly the Russians also announcing that they will target South Korea and Japan with their weapons, never mind North Korea, because they see it as a threat to their security.
Recent protests in South Korea and the citizens' desperate attempts to pressure their government into revoking the decision has once again brought the U.S. military presence in the region into the spotlight. Washington has raised furor by military collaborations with its regional allies and thus worsening regional disputes. The U.S. role in the South China Sea dispute has caused tensions among the littoral states, which each claim the body of water. A major player in the region is China, which is accusing Washington of meddling in regional affairs. Some maintain that the U.S. is only pursuing its own agendas in the region and does not care about the consequences of its decisions.
It seems the mindset in Washington is to pressure the Chinese, to pressure Pyongyang, rather than to address what Chinese concerns are. And it seems by deploying this system, what we're doing is challenging China and also the Russians. We saw that from the People's Daily, there was a very, very strong reaction against this deployment because the Chinese are saying, never mind North Korea, this is a threat to Chinese security.
The United States military deployments around the world, including in East Asia, have long been raising questions, with many calling on Washington to revise its policies and do away with its rather adventurous military presence in other parts of the world, which is blamed for raising tensions in the regions.
Well, let me introduce our guest for this edition of the debate. We have Webster Tarpley joining us from Washington. He is author and historian. And also from Washington, Brent Badowski. He's a columnist at The Hill. Gentlemen, welcome. So I'll start with you, Brent Badowski. Just a simple general question. Why, along with the South Korean president, why is the U.S. so keen in installing the THAAD system in South Korea?
It's called a deterrent. It's an idea that if it is seen by North Korea and others that the United States and the West and other Asian countries are committed to the security of South Korea against a murderous and insane North Korean dictator, that deterrence will prevent them from doing anything. The whole point of a deterrence is to have weapons that will never be used. And that's what that is. It's a sign of strength and resolve. It will go through. It will happen. It is supported by the South Korean government. It is supported by most Asian governments in the region. It is supported by Democrats and Republicans at home in the United States. And I'm very sorry that the Russians are unhappy and their feelings have been hurt, or the Chinese. Regarding the Russians, they're too busy trying to destabilize Ukraine right now as we speak, and the sanctions against Russia still stand. Regarding the Chinese, the United States is supporting virtually everybody in Asia except the Chinese. Almost everyone in Asia is unhappy with the Chinese. They'll have their feelings hurt, but they'll ultimately accept it, and there won't be any trouble in the end. And the deterrents will probably work, and the weapons that will never be used will ultimately be deployed. And you deploy them so you never have to have a war.
Okay, well, you have your pick there, Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, of which points you'd like to react to Brent Badowski there.
Well, the first would be a technical point. This is not even deterrence. Deterrence is a world of mutually assured destruction, and that's not what this is. This is a purely defensive weapon. It can't be used to attack anybody with a first strike, and it can't be used to retaliate after a first strike. It's completely outside of the logic of that. It is a weapon system which is purely defensive. Now, I am very puzzled. Why should anybody be so upset about a purely defensive missile system? I frankly don't see it. I think the Chinese complaints are much overdone. I think I don't agree that Russia is doing anything very bad in Ukraine, but I think China is a different story. China has created now an atmosphere with the absurd and reckless Chinese claims in the South China Sea. I'm afraid they've created an atmosphere where many states feel threatened. And that's Japan, that's South Korea, Taiwan, you can go through the list. Most people, most countries that are involved in that South China Sea area feel that they're being threatened by this overwhelming power of China. I just read an interesting article here where the Chinese People's Daily says the United States will rue the day when these missiles were installed. I'm afraid that's not very good language. I would advise them not to go threatening the United States in that way. So I think what I hope is that all of these things can be made into bargaining chips, and you'd have to have some kind of a global settlement saying the South China Sea is an international waterway, and defensive measures against a country like North Korea, which is anybody's guess anytime, that those are not really illegitimate, and that maybe other countries might want to have their own purely defensive anti-missile systems that ultimately might cool things off.
Okay, so I'm left here to defend some of the points that the critiques have made, since you seem to both be on the same page when it comes to the U.S. presence. So let me start first by asking you, Brent Badowski, even though it's South China and the U.S. is there, I was going to ask you why is the U.S. there, but I'm going to go back to the year 2013 when the U.S. first announced its pivot to Asia. Why did the U.S. have plans for that?
Well, I've never been a big fan of the idea of pivoting to Asia. I think great powers have to be everywhere and involved in everything that affects their security. But fundamentally, what you have is North Korea is led by a nut who is a mass murderer, who is capable of anything. China has done reckless and aggressive actions in the South China Sea, as Mr. Tarpley just said correctly, and has alienated almost every country in Asia. It's really the United States and North Korea and everyone else against China right now in that. Now, what the Chinese have to do, they are also a great nation, but they have to work with their neighbors, not be threatening, not be aggressive, not be hostile. And when they do get aggressive and threatening and hostile, there will be a response from the United States and from other countries in Asia. So there ought to be an agreement and a way of doing business where they all respect each other. But when China violates that, when North Korea violates that, it will be necessary to take action to make sure that they don't make the mistake of thinking that they can get anything that they don't deserve. So whether it's offensive or defensive is not the point with deterrence. The point with deterrence is it demonstrates a resolve and a commitment to defend against any attacks. That defense will stand. The missiles will be deployed. China is isolated, and Mr. Tarpley and I can disagree at some other time about Ukraine, but I think what Putin is doing is being resisted. That's why there are sanctions, and that's why the sanctions remain against Putin.
Well, just on a side note on that, Brent Badowski, Russia has come out and said that they have proof of Crimea and how, of Ukraine and how it was going to go into Crimea, and they're going to release that if they haven't already. But we'll leave that on the side for now. You both, and this question is for you, Webster, Griffin, Tarpley, you're both accusing or citing the fact that there's consensus amongst all the neighbors, mostly in the South China area. We could talk about all the allies of the United States, that they're all somewhat against China, or that China's alienated. Now, I'm looking at the last meeting that took place, the ASEAN meeting, and I'm looking at the final communique, where they couldn't even agree on that because they're not on in a consensus when it comes to China and the South China Sea. I'm reading the headline, sure. The Diplomat, no ASEAN's consensus on the South China Sea. So where does the alienation come from when you don't have consensus when it comes to China regarding the countries in the region?
Well, you have countries that are really not allies of the United States at all. Take Vietnam. Vietnam has now put its own rocket launchers onto some of these Spratly Islands, as I understand it. So there's a pushback that's coming from essentially every country in the region. I would ask if Germany said, the Baltic belongs to us, it's a German lake, or if the Italians said, the Mediterranean belongs to us, it's an Italian lake. This would generate quite a backlash. So I think this is the mistake that China is making. I think it grows out of the internal predicament of President Xi and Prime Minister Li, that the two of them came in with an anti-corruption campaign, which was simply a mask for the recreation of a highly centralized authoritarian government, and that they have failed in terms of economics. In other words, the Chinese stock market crisis, which goes on, and the continuing troubles in the Chinese economy, those were not necessary, but they happened because Xi and Li came in and said, we're not going to have any stimulus. So they've gotten themselves into this situation. They're trying to solve their internal unpopularity by creating foreign adventures, and this is very dangerous. The other thing that I would point to, the big untold story behind all of this, is the British-Chinese alliance. People have to remember, President Xi went to London in the middle of last October and stipulated a complete alliance between the Chinese and Great Britain. And part of this is that London is going to become the main trading hub of the renminbi. And I think it's also that the British, who are geopolitical practitioners and divide and conquer operatives from way back, I think they're giving China a lot of very bad advice. So I think when you put the British into this, the British-Chinese bloc, this is what takes on a sinister aspect. And I would call everybody's attention to it because it's vastly underreported. The story behind the Brexit was nothing but the fact that the Chinese have chosen to go with the British.
Okay, well, let's focus.
And I would also say that Russia is ill-advised to follow that. That's not going to be good for Russia.
Follow what?
Follow the British-Chinese bloc. In other words, Russia does not need to get involved in the South China Sea. I mean, they can have an opinion, of course, but the idea of somehow tying yourself to this Chinese-British combine, I think that's not wise.
Okay, well, I'm looking at some of the grievances, Brent Badowski, that exist in this area. We can focus on what is going on regarding South Korea. South Koreans are obviously concerned, not all, but many, especially in the county where this THAAD missile system is going to be placed, Sungju County. Looking at what's going on in Okinawa, you know, there's lots of rejections there, especially the fact that the U.S. has a military presence there. So it's not like the area is totally in support of U.S. moves in the region. Don't you think that in some respects then the U.S. is creating tensions there?
Well, I think it's important for the U.S. to do everything and even more than we're doing to reduce tensions. The Okinawa is a legitimate issue. It's a legitimate problem. On the other hand, there were people in Japan pushing to rearm the Japanese military, which would be a horrendous, horrendous mistake. But yeah, there needs to be greater sensitivity. There's no question about it. But at the same time, there needs to be a deterrent, a statement of credibility, a statement of resolve in all of those. What you have going on in Asia fundamentally is China is being aggressive and trying to be expansionist, and virtually everyone around China in Asia fears it, dislikes it, and supports American attempts to neutralize it, to keep Asia, to keep the open seas open, not Chinese, and to keep the situation stable and not have any more aggression. So there's a balance that needs to be made between sensitivity, which has to exist, and resolve and strength, which also has to exist and does exist. China should be a good neighbor, not an aggressor, not an expansionist power. China has alienated the entire Asian region, possibly with the exception of the crazy madman and mass murderer in North Korea, but even they don't listen to the Chinese in North Korea. But what the United States is doing is seeking a balance of diplomacy and military deterrence, resolve and sensitivity. I think it's a good policy. I think it's a sound policy. And by the way, I think Britain fundamentally agrees with that policy. They have issues in Hong Kong, obviously, that they want to keep stable. But China should become a good neighbor. And when they are, it'll work. When they're not and they become aggressive, it will unify everyone against China in Asia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I got to put this question in because we're looking at the U.S. presidential elections. Webster Griffin Tarpley, and I don't know what your thoughts are on Mr. Donald Trump, but he has said or suggested that Japan and South Korea could get nuclear weapons to defend themselves rather than depend on the U.S. military.
I have to say, first of all, I consider myself one of the leading opponents of Trump. I consider Trump to be a fascist, a psychotic. This is a person whose hands must never get anywhere near the nuclear button. He is a disgrace to the United States. He has outdone himself in lunatic ravings, and it's profoundly anti-American, the racism that he proposes. The United States has treaty obligations to Japan, treaty obligations to South Korea. Those should be maintained. If you're going to do any changes with those things, it has to be done very carefully, very gradually, and with a kind of a consensus and a diplomatic process among all concerned parties, not this lunatic shooting from the hip and, you know, shooting off his yap, which is what we see Trump doing. So I think the status quo in general is not a bad idea. I think the status quo in this world today has a lot to be said for it. So I would keep the status quo for now. Theoretically, of course, you could say the U.S. bases in Okinawa and so forth should be drawn down. Fine, but that's not going to happen when we have these sweeping claims, unprecedented claims to the entire South China Sea. This is simply impossible. So you can't have both. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Yeah, but maintaining the status quo, Brent Badowski, is only, it can't be limited to the configuration that it is right now. There's got to be some resolve there. We can talk about South Korea. We can talk about, well, Okinawa. We can talk about the presence of the U.S. there, which is, you know, provoking China by many accounts, even though, of course, you have your views on how China is trying to be the ruler of that region. So the status quo can't be maintained. So what is the next step?
Well, first of all, when it comes to Occupy Wall Street, the economy, Bernie Sanders, and some of the issues in Europe and with banks, I'm against the status quo, and I think we need change in favor of the people. When it comes to Asia, the status quo is actually very good. We agree on that. You have a deterrence that is credible, and the next step is to keep that deterrence credible. Donald Trump is an ignoramus. He is a madman. He is a lunatic in terms of foreign policy. The worst change to the status quo would be to give nuclear bombs to Japan and have Japan remilitarize, or to have South Korea have nuclear bombs. The alternative to that, which is reckless and wrong and horrible, is an America and Western and ASEAN security umbrella that provides that protection under the current framework, which should be continued. And then you can have a relations with China that realizes, once it realizes they cannot get away with cheating or being aggressive, then we'll return to more friendly relations. But it's up to China to make the move. But the current security umbrella is far better than rearming Japan, or having Japan and South Korea get nuclear weapons, or tolerating aggression from China, which will not be tolerated by anyone in Asia or the United States.
Very well. We're going to have to wrap up the show. Unfortunately, we're fresh out of time. That was Brent Badowski, columnist at The Hill, talking to us from Washington, and also Webster Griffin Tarpley, author and historian, talked to us from Washington. Thanks so much for tuning in to another edition of Debate. From me, Tarpley, and the entire team of the Capital Tehran, goodbye.